So we hear the rhetoric out of Washington all the time. Parties pitted against each other on how to help the economy grow, on government spending, taxation, who should be taxed more or less, what's making the U.S. go broke. Earlier this week, we heard President Obama lay into the Republican budget, which was passed in the House of Representatives last week. He said this.
It is a Trojan horse. Disguised as deficit reduction plans, it is really an attempt to impose a radical vision on our country. It is thinly veiled social Darwinism.
Ooh, and then on the right, you have people like the Republican presidential hopeful, the frontrunner, Mitt Romney, blaming Obama for what he calls European-scale unemployment.
If you adopt European policies, it's not surprising you're going to have European unemployment. And he has adopted European policies with health care, with taxation, with regulation, with energy policies.
But then you see the two parties put aside their differences sometimes and come together on something like the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act. It's touted as a bipartisan achievement. Obama signed it today. You heard what he said when I played that at the top of the show. And we've seen Republican leaders like Eric Cantor who have been touting it too. Take a listen.
The Jobs Act will get small businesses and entrepreneurs back into the game by removing costly regulations and making it easier for them to access capital.
Okay, so everyone's agreeing. So what's the catch here? There's got to be one, right? Well, the problem is critics who have been on our show, who work in finance or have worked regulating it, white-collar criminologists, say this is what the so-called Jobs Act really jumpstarts.
You're creating a lot of jobs for people who want to turn to a life of crime.
Everybody that knows about fraud has said this bill is calamitous. It's not bad. It is unbelievable. It is the wish list of every fraud-friendly practice in the world put together in a bill.
They'll be advertising bogus shares. They don't have to provide accounting statements. They don't have to be accountable to investors. This is a formula for disaster. I've never seen anything like this. And in addition, it's going to allow people to basically write research reports touting stocks. When did we get into trouble with that before? With WorldCom, with other issues?
Oh, gee, it sounds great. So it rolls back a host of securities laws for companies going public. So IPO rules for so-called emerging growth companies, which can have up to $1 billion in revenue, okay? So that's not a small number. That's not exactly how you'd think of your typical small business. And they'll get out of audits and accounting rules as examples. And it also breaks down the separation between research analysts and investment bankers who work for the same firm. So it allows banks, for example, underwriting IPOs, to issue reports ahead of stock offerings, opening the door to pump and dump schemes like you just heard Janet Tavakoli talking about there. Now, it was recommended by Obama's Jobs Council, which has been led by GE Chairman Jeff Immelt and includes 19 corporate chairmen and CEOs out of its 27 members. So what is this all really about? You know, because it doesn't really seem like what it is on its face. Is this really just the latest example of bipartisan support when it comes to supporting moneyed corporate business interests that are heavily influential in Washington? Well, here to help us talk about this whole issue is John Perkins, because he is a former economic hitman, and he's author of Hoodwinked. An economic hitman reveals why the world financial markets imploded and what we need to do to remake them. So we're going to figure out today how we can do anything about this. So first, Mr. Perkins, thanks for being on the show. It's always really a pleasure to talk to you.
It's great to be with you today. Thank you.
Thanks. So when you hear something like this Jobs Act, which has this bipartisan support and sounds the way politicians have talked about it, like it's this great thing that's going to reduce barriers for small businesses to raise capital, sounds great. But then when you hear more about the fine print from a lot of experts, it just sounds like Wall Street interests are going to get their way at peeling back regulation, or corporate interests are going to have more leeway, that sort of thing. Does this to you sound like Washington's bipartisan support for corporate welfare?
It certainly does, you know, and I'm not familiar with all the details of the act, but everything that I've heard about it and read about it, it certainly sounds like a boondoggle for business. And it's kind of interesting because at the same time, Obama is and many other politicians are supporting what's called the Stock act, which is to stop Congress from insider trading or using insider trading to its benefit. So you get these two kinds of things going on at once, which is very, very interesting to me.
Why is it interesting to you? Because what is it representative of?
Well, we're saying on the one hand, we're not going to allow for insider trading among congressmen, which is a very good thing. But on the other hand, we're also saying that we're going to kind of set up a carte blanche for businesses to deceive us. And we're using that as a way of saying this is going to create more jobs. But as one of your earlier speakers pointed out, you played that it seems like it's going to create more jobs for, robber barons, basically.
For robber barons. So let's stick on this issue of robber barons, because as another example of this trend, we've seen Obama come out recently say, hey, we want to undo the subsidies for the oil industries, and Republicans quickly got in the way of that in the Senate. But just before that, Democrats had voted down bringing it forward. Instead, they wanted to move on to talking about postal service reform, and Obama wasn't complaining too much, so that was criticized as political theater when he came out and made that speech. So is there anybody in Washington who's an elected official, that is, who really wants to undo corporate welfare like oil subsidies for some of these largest corporations?
Listen, here we are at this time when Citizens United is being withheld. There's a huge movement in the United States to have a 28th Amendment to basically do away with the Citizens United rule, but that rule gives corporations a tremendous amount of power for financing campaigns. It's an election year, and Citizens United stands. So these corporations have tremendous power. So everybody's jockeying to get corporate money, and at the same time make it look as though they're defending we the people. But the fact of the matter is, for politics today, we the people are secondary in importance to the big corporations, because the big corporations provide the money for campaign financing, and everyone knows that the campaign with the greatest finances has the greatest likelihood of winning, whether it's for the presidency or whether it's towards Senate seat or a congressional seat.
Right, and we hear this issue come up again. It always seems to boil down to Citizens United for a lot of people. But what is really the answer? Because say, for example, in a magical world, we did change the laws and we made things more fair. We do live in a global society today. So would businesses just go to where it's more business friendly?
Businesses go there anyway. You look at Halliburton, move to Dubai, and today most businesses don't look at themselves as being American businesses. The big ones don't. They have no loyalty at all to the United States. They work on all over the world, and they follow whatever laws best suit them. But certainly the United States has the largest market in the world. We're less than 5% of the world's population, and we consume nearly 30% of the world's resources. So they really struggle to have the most friendly laws in the United States. Wherever they go, they're going to want to have laws in the United States that favor them. And I think what we need to understand is that we, the people, must speak up against this. Corporations right now are there to serve that infamous 1%. They're not there to serve a public interest. We need to go back to the history, the roots of our country, where for 100 years, corporations could not get chartered in the United States unless they could prove that they were going to serve a public interest. I think that's a good idea. They can still make a profit. They can still pay back a decent rate of return to their investors. But we need to come back to this idea that the corporations are there to serve us, we the people. They're not just there to serve a few extremely wealthy robber barons.
But how do you undo that? Because it's not only these very powerful interests that have a lot of influence over the political system, but also this gets to the very root of how the business model is conceived of and taught in the U.S. and any business class you walk into.
You're absolutely right. But it hasn't always been that way. When I went to business school in the late 60s, I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for his investors, in other words, makes a profit, but he also takes good care of his customers and his employees. He gives good health care, insurance, pension funds for retirement, and he's a good a good citizen in the communities where his business operates. He's willing to pay good, sufficient taxes to support the community, and he goes beyond that to support schools, to build schools, to pay for recreation centers for children, these sorts of things. And you notice that I'm using the term he, And it's because, let's face it, most corporate executives today, the most powerful ones, are men. I think if we had more women in these jobs, actually, we might have a more nurturing society. We have not seen that sometimes with women in charge of corporations, but that's because there's this tremendous male mentality out there that says, as some of my indigenous friends say, men steal nests, women build nests. And I think we need to get more into this mentality of we need to build good nests, and these nests need to be for all the people, for we the people, and go back to that basic premise that operated in the United States for the first 100 years of our history.
I hear what you're saying, but we just also talked about how now these businesses, these huge corporations, don't see themselves as tethered to any place. They don't see themselves necessarily as American companies first or entitled to wherever it is that they're based. They're global. So how do you get any sense of responsibility over the community that you're existing in?
Well, you look at it as a global community, truly. But each place where you're doing business becomes that location, and this has always been the case. So, for example, the car manufacturers back when I was a young man were in Detroit, but the dealerships were all over the place. And the dealership in the town where I lived took a tremendous responsibility for that community. And overall, the Detroit companies took a responsibility for their employees wherever they were. And I think we need to look at that today. So a company that operates in 100 countries, its branches in those countries need to take responsibility in each of those countries. In countries where it has manufacturing plants, it needs to take good care of its laborers in those countries, give them health care, give them insurance, give them pension funds, make sure they have decent incomes. And in countries where it's just selling its goods and doesn't have any manufacturing plants, it needs to make sure it provides really good goods and good services, and it provides a really decent market for those who are buying its products. So this, it is part of this. Have business globally and also act locally and responsibly locally.
And it's a great idea. I want to talk more about how we can possibly get there with all of these issues that exist that we're talking about. We're going to go to break, but when we come back, we will have more with former economic hitman John Perkins. And still ahead here, it's dining and dashing motorcade style. We'll give you our 3 cents on what money the police say Obama owes them. But first, your closing market numbers.
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
I have a confession. I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Welcome back. With the signing of the Jobs Act today in the U.S., which critics say simply opens the door to massive fraud, Wall Street pump and dump schemes, allows companies to not report a lot of accounting and audit rules or adhere to them when they go public, companies that make up to $1 billion. We're talking about how to deal with this issue of entrenched corporate interests and corporate welfare in Washington, which really garners bipartisan support. Okay, these are the bipartisan achievements, ones that don't necessarily benefit the people that they say they're benefiting. So John Perkins is talking with us. He's former economic hitman and author of Hoodwinked. An economic hitman reveals why the world's financial markets imploded and what we need to do to remake them, because we're talking about how to remake them. And before the break, we were talking about global companies that need to serve local interests, and we need to rethink what a company's priorities are. But I guess the question I have, the biggest question, is how do we ever get that to be reality? Because we see all of these issues, whether it's regulators that fail to regulate even what's on the books, whether it's the entrenched money interest in Washington that influence every law or get subsidies or whatever. You know, how do we really change this?
Well, it's a great question, and I think there's a fairly easy answer, although not necessarily easy to implement to that. But before I get into that, just very quickly, you know, it strikes me, I travel a lot in Latin America and Asia and the Middle East, and we talk often about banana republics and corruption in these countries. Yeah. And in a way, I think we're the biggest banana republic out there. You know, we've kind of got a monoculture economy that's pretty much based on the military to a large degree, right, and then providing a bunch of junk to very rich people. And we have tremendous corruption. This revolving door thing that we have, where you've got, you know, the watchdog agencies over the oil companies run by former oil company executives who are going to go back to work as executives at oil companies. It's an incredibly corrupt system. Right. And we have to recognize that politics is extremely limited because of this corruption and because of the money politicians receive. So we need to, our leverage is directly with the corporations. And you know, when I was in college, we got rid of apartheid in South Africa because we boycotted corporations that supported it. Some of our rivers were terribly polluted. We went after the corporations. We refused to buy from corporations that were polluting rivers until they cleaned them up. We did the same thing with corporations to get them to open their doors wider to women and minorities. I think we have to recognize is that as a consumer, every one of us has a tremendous amount of power. Whenever we buy something or decide not to, we're casting a ballot. And it's probably more important than the ballot we cast every 2 years or 4 years at the election polls. So we need to be really aware of how we shop, and we need to pressure these corporations. So, for example, I love Nike products. I hate the fact that a lot of their goods are still made by slaves in sweatshops in places like Indonesia. It's not enough for me just not to buy their products. I need to send an email. Every time I buy something that could be a Nike product, I send an email to Nike and say, hey, I love your products. I want to buy them. Start paying your people in Indonesia and elsewhere fair wages, give them health insurance and retirement funds, and I'll buy your product.
I wonder if Mr. Perkins, if this is shifting a little bit, the power that the U.S. consumer does have, because in these emerging economies, we see consumer classes growing, and that's where a lot of these multinational corporations are looking at their growth. So how much does the U.S. consumer really have, and is this more of a global consumer's duty now?
Well, we are still less than 5% of the world's population consuming about 30% of the world's resources. The American consumer has a tremendous amount of power. It may be getting watered down a little bit, but we've got tremendous power. And we get to also remember that in a lot of the other parts of the world, people are taking action. The Europeans are much more proactive than we are. They've really been fighting GMOs in their food very successfully. They've got another battle coming up now, but they've been pretty successful. And I travel around a lot. I just came back from the Middle East 2 weeks ago. I go to China, I go to Europe, I go to South America. And all over the world, we're seeing people rise up and taking control. We're even seeing it in places like Russia, where they're demonstrating against Putin. Who would have heard of this a while ago? So we're not alone in this. And I think people really see the United States as the leader. So if we start to really develop consumerism and consumer movements, the rest of the world will follow.
So it's the responsibility of people because, as you said, corporations and government are so close you cannot count on elected officials. I just have to ask you this because you're talking about, we don't have a lot of time left. We're talking about how you're traveling around now. You used to travel around in a different capacity going to these countries as an economic hitman, and you've been very critical of the World Bank in those processes where they saddled countries with debt in order to garner resources that were benefiting foreign companies that would come in and buy them. I'm curious, we've seen a lot of coverage of the latest nominees to the World Bank president, and now there are more than one. It's a U.S. nominee, also one from Colombia and also Nigeria, I believe. I'm wondering if you think that anything could change with the World Bank.
Well, absolutely. The World Bank has a mission statement that says its job is to reconstruct devastated parts of the world. That mission statement was formulated back at the end of World War II, and it did a pretty good job in Europe of doing that. And then it became a representative of capitalism against the rising power of the Soviet Union. And it stayed with that, even though we've had détente, and the Soviet Union has pretty much collapsed in terms of a huge economic power. But in that process, the World Bank became very big friends to corporations. And it can exert a lot of power over these corporations. I have hope for the World Bank. I wish it would step back into its mission statement and do what it's meant to do, which is to reconstruct devastated parts of the world. And let's face it, our corporations could play a huge role in that. You know, we've got people starving throughout Africa. How about getting Monsanto and Dole and Chiquita and some of these companies that have been destroying the Earth's agricultural resources with chemical fertilizers, get them to find better ways for starving people to grow food more efficiently, store it, and distribute it.
It's a great solution you propose. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but I'm glad you're giving us a little bit of hope here. That was John Perkins. I wish we had more time. We're going to have to leave it there for today. He's a former economic hitman.
Thank you.